Once again, I'd like to thank you for joining me as we continue our studies together in what is known as the Gospel of Mark, the book which contains, as we've already seen, what the author Mark considers the best of all good news in the person of Jesus. So let me read to you the passage we're studying today, Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. And we read there, "When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, 'My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so that she will be healed and live.' So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, 'If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed.' Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, 'Who touched my clothes?' 'You see the people crowding against you,' his disciples answered, 'and yet you can ask, who touched me?' But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.' While Jesus was speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. 'Your daughter is dead,' they said. 'Why bother the teacher anymore?' Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, 'Don't be afraid. Just believe.' He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, 'Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep.' But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, 'Talitha cum,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, get up.' Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. I've already suggested in our previous studies that these verses are contained within a larger section of Mark's book, which runs from chapter 4 verse 35 to verse 5 verse 43, which we've just read. In this section, Mark records 3 eyewitness accounts of incidents in which Jesus demonstrates his miraculous powers. This passage therefore contains the last of the 3. The first of these stories was the calming of the storm in chapter 4 verses 35 to 41. This, as we saw, demonstrated Jesus' power and authority over the created order. A violent storm was stopped in its tracks by a simple word from Jesus. The story we looked at last time in chapter 5 verses 1 to 20 described the healing of a man possessed with a host of demons. There could scarcely have been a better example of the authority which Jesus exercised over the malevolent forces of darkness who attempt to oppose God and seek to control us and our world so as to bring us to destruction. The power of nature and the evil that seems embedded in the very fabric of our world are, if we have any discernment, still powers before which we find ourselves helpless and hopeless. However, as Mark tells his story, he wants us to understand that in Jesus these powers find their ultimate victor. Nature is restored and the powers of evil overthrown, in each case by a simple command from Jesus. In each incident, there's no evidence that Jesus even raised his voice. A simple, quiet command was enough to send his and our enemies packing. So we come to the present passage and we might anticipate its message. For the other great enemy we all face is death. In the face of death, every single one of us is powerless. Death is the inevitable grim reaper who will harvest each one of us. But, as this story reveals, death itself was also powerless in the presence of Jesus. But let's look at the story in greater detail. At the heart of the story are two tragedies. First, there is the unnamed woman who had suffered for 12 years with a gynaecological problem which had proved beyond the ability of the medical profession to heal. The constant loss of what we sometimes call our life's blood must have left her weak and feeling nearer to death than to the life she had formerly enjoyed. But there was worse. Within the culture in which she lived, religion dictated that someone suffering from such a disorder was excluded from the social and religious life of the community. She was an outcast. And a large part of the problem was that to touch someone who was seen to be unclean meant that the contagion would be passed on to the person who was touched. This fact explains the cautious way in which the woman approached Jesus. Helpless she may have been, and perhaps desperately seeing Jesus as her only hope, she touched him, believing herself to be virtually invisible in the large crowd that pressed in upon Jesus. We've already read the sequel. Immediately the woman sensed that the healing she'd longed for so many years was now hers. Thrilled as she must have been, she clearly intended to slink away quietly. However, Jesus was having none of it. Gently he led her to make herself known and commended her trust in him. She may have been society's outcast, but now this poor woman is publicly honoured by Jesus as family. However, there's another fact in this part of the story that we must not miss. The whole religious system of Jesus' day was designed to establish a clear divide between the holy and the contagion of evil. But while evil could, as we've already seen, be ritually transmitted to another, the reverse was not true. Holiness could not be passed on or caught. In fact, where holiness encountered evil, it also became contaminated until, that is, Jesus appeared on the scene. Here, holiness in the form of healing is passed on, while Jesus is uncontaminated by evil. In this way, Mark is telling us Jesus possessed attributes that are and can only be possessed by God. One final point can be made in this part of the present passage. When Jesus speaks to the woman, he says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Jesus' tenderness and affirmation of the woman is, as we've already implied, lovely. He emphasizes her faith. But he also places a benediction on her with the single word, peace, while telling her she has been saved from her suffering. There can be little doubt that Jesus was not merely reaffirming her healing, but he was looking beyond her physical healing to his meeting of her spiritual needs. Indeed, to speak peace to her and declare her spiritual well-being was something that only one who was God could say. Small wonder then that Mark includes this remarkable event in his Gospel. However, the story of this unknown woman is part of an envelope or a filling of a sandwich, within which the story of a young girl is told. We're immediately struck by the contrast. Here we encounter a man and one of the leaders of the local community, and in his case he's named. He's Jairus, and his daughter is dying. Interesting, she is 12 and therefore on the threshold of maturity. By way of contrast, the woman who Jesus healed had suffered the entire length of this little girl's life. The woman has, as we had seen, approached Jesus secretly. There was, however, no secrecy about Jairus' approach. He was used to the exercise of power. However, authority can appear to mock the powerful in the face of death, especially the death of one who is very dear. So in his desperation, like the woman, he too sought Jesus' help. The details of the story do not need to occupy us. We've already read them. Simply by the time that Jesus was ready to go to Jairus' home, his daughter had succumbed to her illness. However, just as Jesus had healed a half-dead woman, he showed he could restore to life a dead child. He had authority over life and death. If then the previous two stories have demonstrated Jesus' authority over the forces of nature and the evil powers that inhabit our world in order to wreak destruction, so this story shows he has power over death itself. And very simply, only God incarnate could do this. For these powers still hold our world in their hands, as we all recognize when we reflect upon our own experience. However, the two stories that have been part of our study today also demonstrate that Jesus is ready to meet the needs of all, especially our deepest needs. Thus there could be no greater contrast than the penniless, nameless woman and the ruler of the synagogue, and yet, despite the fragility of each one's understanding of Jesus and their faith in him, Jesus responded with great compassion to both of them when they sought his help, whether they were the great and the good, or the powerless and helpless. Mark's retelling of these events is surely intended to suggest that this Jesus is unchangeably the same. He is ready as no one else to meet your needs and mine today and every day. And so we're invited to trust him. Like the woman and Jairus, we may not understand much about Jesus. However, both of these desperate people found that Jesus was able to help them when in despair they humbly asked for his help. So we are called to trust Jesus in our day-to-day needs and in the great issues of life. There is no one else who can help us like him, for he is God incarnate.